we will, as lecturer, briefly propose you two case studies somehow concerning the exploration of boundaries. The first one will be about the Dictionary of Museology. The second is very well connected because it's about the museum definition. Actually, the theme of exploring boundaries is pretty old. It used to be the main theme of the International Conference of ICOM, of the General Assembly of ICOM in 1992. Museum rethinking the boundaries. Why? Because actually at that moment already the museum world was evolving very fast, and it was at that moment really essential to think about what would be the museum world tomorrow, what would be a museum and what would not be a museum, etc. This is somehow the aim of the Dictionary of Museology. It's to explore somehow these boundaries. As you might know, the dictionary was a 5 to 6 years project that was launched in the Prague conference in French version, Dictionnaire de Museologie, published by Herman Collin, and 1 year later in English by Routledge. There are some projects of translation in Chinese and other languages. I hope it will, of course, continue. The responsibility of, well, I was charged of the responsibility of this dictionary, but of course I was held by a very important editing committee with representation from different parts of the world. Yves Bergeron, for instance, from Canada, Eiji Mizujima for Asia and Japan, Sharon MacDonald, who was from Germany and the UK, Markus Walz also, who was very close to the Stransky's movement of thoughts, and of course from Germany, John Fall from the US, Peter Davis from the UK. Oh, the music is not from the UK, I don't know. But of course, this editing committee was managing much more numerous number of writers. I will not give the names of all of the 80, more or less 80 authors that produced the Dictionary of Museology. This is their short biography. The project of the museum, of the dictionary, was to make a kind of, I would say, a census of the different way these terms that form the museum fields were produced. So it was not programmatic somehow. It was partly descriptive and partly also giving a kind of direction on what would be the right use of the term. It's the case, for instance, with the term museology itself. There was no one definition of museology, but it was a kind of synthesis of all of the different terms, all of the different ways it was used around the world. And there were three global ways of conceiving museology. The first one was linking museology as a field of research or a body of knowledge, which is somehow really the way that ICOFOM saw it, by producing knowledge among museology, among the museum field. And actually, it's, of course, already speaks about the link between museology and museums, but also about other forms of institutions that are closed by the museums, but that could not be called museums because they were, I mean, old-fashioned forms or very old forms, such as Cabinet of Curiosities, but also some new forms that are still not called, for the moment, somehow museums, or when somebody, some people say, no, these are not museums, etc. So, of course, it's about a kind of global phenomenon that is evolving. The second way of thinking about museology was seen as, of course, an academic discipline, which was very much, of course, the case for instance, I already spoke about this, the Stransky School of Museology somehow in Brno, but also, for instance, in a more precise sense, it's also in some countries, such for instance in Brazil, that museology could be seen. In some other countries, museology is much more linked with not just an academic science, an academic discipline, but also as a kind of general body of theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. This is definitely, for instance, the way that the manual, the handbook Museum Basic is conceived. Not only about a theoretical point of view on museums, but as a global way of considering what you need to understand if you want to work in a museums, etc. What I would like to do in the next minutes is to speak about the genesis of the dictionary, because it's closely linked with the history of ICOFOM, which started in 1977. The ICOFOM committee, the Committee for Museology, was founded by Jan Jelinek, who was at that moment president of ICOM. He was working in Czechoslovakia at that moment. He was director of the Moravska Museum. And he was really the founder of this movement. Sorry. The ICOFOM committee was really clearly devoted to trying to make museology as a science. It was at that moment its more central program, I would say. And then, of course, trying also to publish some of the results of its discussions through different journals. The first one was Museological Working Papers, or MUWAP d'Otram, and the second was ICOFOM Study Series that still exists, which started in the beginning of the 80s with the next president, Vinovchovka. At that moment already, from the foundation somehow, there was a project of creating and writing an important treaty on museology in order, within ICOM, to show what would be the basis for museum thinking. And that project was really ambitious. It was, of course, shared by Jan Jelinek, but also by the former director of ICOM, Georges-Henri Rivière, and also other thinkers such as, of course, Zbigniew Stransky from Czechoslovakia, also some people such as brilliant thinker Valdizar Ruscio, different people from other countries, because, as you know, of course, ICOFOM from the beginning was very international, and of course it's great value among all of the museum community. It's its network, which is supposed to be really international and representing the different view of considering museum theory. But the treaty started to be bigger and bigger, the project for the treaty. At that moment, Rivière, Stransky, etc., wanted to have a kind of 5 volumes treaty of museology. And as it was somehow too ambitious, it was never published, which happens very often somehow, unfortunately. So after a while, Vinovchovka decided to publish not a treaty, but to concentrate and to focus on ISS, the ICOFOM study series. But somebody that you might know also, who was Martin Scherer, and who was also president of the ICOFOM during the beginning of the 90s, Martin Scherer, who went several times to the Baltic School of Museology, of course. At that moment, when he was a president, he decided and proposed to ICOFOM to start again to work on the thesaurus of museology in order to explore some of the basic terms of museology and to propose a definition that could be adopted by the global museum community in order to share a common language. Because it's actually the case of the common language to share in order to discuss, in order to communicate within the whole museum society. That project was chaired by André Desvallées, who was, I would say, the disciple of Georges-Henri Rivière. He worked closely with him. And André Desvallées started to prepare a structure for this thesaurus. And he started to decide about the number of terms that should be used. And there were something like 200 terms to define. And a lot of people told him, yes, this is a very good idea, and just go for it. But actually, he was not so much helped. And the project started very rapidly in the 90s to be published. But after a while, it was very difficult to continue it. I became a board member of ICOFOM in the beginning of the years 2000, as far as I remember, 2001. I was chosen with also Norma Rusconi to help André Desvallées in the continuation of the thesaurus. In this context, a discussion on the museum definition appeared in the beginning of the year 2004 and continued until 2007. You might know that before the 2022 definition of Prague, there was already several discussions concerning this definition. Hello, Agrita. Welcome to you. About, of course, the museum definition process. And at that moment, actually, all of this discussion, and it's very important to understand it, all of this discussion was in English. It was online. It was first chaired by Gary Edson, then by Miss Murphy. Most of the people who answered, who were participating to this online discussion, were English-speaking. Which means that most of the people who were not speaking English were very silent. And most of the people who were actually working on ICOFOM were not English-speaking, at least very fluently. So that's the reason why actually ICOFOM at that moment was very silent. It was very silent until 2005, when ICOFOM decided to organize a symposium. Actually, it was on the public, but then it evolved during the symposium to be on the museum definition. And from that moment, ICOFOM decided to publish a collection of articles that proved to be at the end, and it was published 2 years later in French, Vers une redéfinition du musée. Actually, it was also published a couple of years later in Latvian. It was somehow the contribution of ICOFOM to this debate concerning the museum definition, which is so important for the museum community. And at that moment, of course, it was also decided that this movement on the discussion of the museum definition should be really evolving and should contribute also to the redaction and the final redaction of the Thesaurus of Museology. And in the case, on the opposition of the writing of 200 terms and 200 definitions, it was decided to make a much shorter list of terms in order to publish it shortly. And this is it gave the birth to the key concept of museology. It was decided to discuss all of these 21st terms, 21 key concepts in museology. And this very small booklet was published in 2010, translated in 3 other languages. So French, it was written in French, and then it was translated in English, in Spanish, and in Chinese, and it was presented in the Shanghai conference in 2010. But then it continued actually to be translated, and finally it has been translated in something like 15 different languages. What was the aim? The aim was actually to try to agree on these more or less global definitions on what was supposed to be the most important and most influential concepts of museology at that moment, these 21 concepts. These 21 concepts were actually only, and the key concept of museology, were actually just a small introduction to a more global project, which was the Dictionnaire encyclopédique de muséologie, Encyclopedic Dictionary of Museology, but which was only published in French. Why was it only published in French? Because there were actually only French-speaking authors who participated to this. Why? Because actually we had some problems of translations. And at that moment, we couldn't solve the problem of actually money for translating. So that's the reason why, as of course André Desvallées was French-speaking, I was French-speaking, we decided to gather a team of French-speaking authors at that moment that could produce some texts very rapidly and that could actually propose this dictionary. There were people such as Yves Bergeron, Martin Scherer, of course André Desvallées, Bernard Deloche, etc. And this very young guy at that moment was me a long time ago. So these were the 21 terms of the dictionary, the Dictionnaire encyclopédique de muséologie, that actually has been finally published and translated in two other languages. The first one being Polish, and the second one being Japanese. But there is still an ongoing translation in Brazilian, thanks to Bruno and a lot of a team of translators. What were, at that moment, the final list of these 21 concepts was all of these ones. Architecture, I will not read it. Museology, of course, but also museography or applied museology, musealization, museum preservation, profession, etc. It's interesting to understand that at that moment, when we thought about what would be a thesaurus, what would be a dictionary actually of museology, there were some short definitions, more or less 400 short definitions. But the encyclopedic part was just linked with these 21 terms. And all of them were really focusing on actually, I would say, the functions of the museum, preservation, research, and communication. They were really developed in close parallel ideas of the ICOFOM, and for instance, also the ideas of Peter van Mensch and its PRC model, preservation, research, and communication. It was also linked with some very important terms, such as musealization, that was coined by people such as Zbigniew-Stransky, etc. But it was very much connected with the machine itself, I would say, and some of the terms that would be really seen as museological. As you understood it, it was very difficult because the whole project of the Dictionnaire encyclopédique was a kind of 800 pages. And of course, we wanted to, after actually the French edition proved to be a real big success, we sold something like 2,500 exemplars of the dictionary, which is really a lot for French-speaking literature, especially in museums. But, of course, we knew that it would not be read in Anglo-Saxon countries, for instance. So, of course, also, we knew that we would never receive any money from companies, Anglo-Saxon companies, in order to translate it. So we asked for money, some money to ICOM that gave generously something like 3,000 euros. And of course, it was not enough at all to translate the whole dictionary. So we could succeed to translate some articles, but it was not possible to propose a global traduction. But why this challenge? Because actually, if you want to share this common knowledge, you need to share also the language. And of course, at that moment, the most important language was, of course, English. and not, of course, French, that proved to be reducing and more. Of course, there were some emerging languages, such as Chinese, but it was actually very difficult, even for Chinese, to translate it in Chinese. They said that it could be much easier to come from English to translate it in Chinese, because, of course, they had much more translator from English to Chinese. So it was a challenge, but it was not only a challenge for, I would say, what we would call the spread of the ideas of the dictionary, but it was also a challenge for what concerned the structure and the influence of the language. We knew that actually the way of conceiving and of writing influences the way of thinking. And of course, French-speaking thinkers do not think the same as English-speaking thinkers, and do not think the same as other language thinkers. Just think about, this is the structure of 3 important books. The first one is the book that was written by Georges-Henri Rivière, well, not by him, but it was his course. It was called La Museologie, the Museology. It was printed in 1989. The second, Museum Basics, is the handbook. And the third, Stransky, Museology, Introduction to Studies, was, of course, published in Brno, in the Czech Republic at that moment. And you could see just from the structure of the book how different the museum phenomenon is explored. In museology, it's the link between museums and society, and research, conservation. In museum basics, it starts with the users, it starts with the public. And of course, it's not a coincidence, because the link between the public or the people, museums are for people, is much closer than, for instance, in France. In Stransky's booklet, it was totally different. It was much more theoretical, insisting on metamuseology, the relation and the general system of museology, etc. So actually, it's very important also to understand that how much, when you write in one language, it influences the whole way you are considering this topic. So that's also why, actually, it could be said about a colonization of spirits by just spreading some languages in favor or in opposition to other ones. What is also interesting is to see these global debates in the light of how the museum phenomenon is shared in the world. We know that, of course, the museum phenomenon is widespread, is worldwide spread. But actually, it is all very nice to say, okay, the museum phenomenon is global, etc., etc. But the density, the number of museums, if you compare it with the inhabitants, etc., is totally different. It's very much concentrated in, of course, Europe, Northern America. It's a bit less concentrated in Latin America. It's mostly not concentrated at all in Africa. And of course, there were a lot of people speaking about the global boom of museums in China, and sometimes at a certain moment there was the inauguration of one museum each day in China. But if you just compare it with the number of inhabitants, actually it's not, and it's still not, very important in Asia, this museum phenomenon. But it means also, this density, etc., that of course the number of museum trainings, the repartition of museum trainings is also different. And the repartition of journals in museology is also different. It's also not the same. It is still, of course, very much linked with Northern Europe, but also actually Latin America, especially actually Brazil, of course, United States, and some other countries. What is interesting is, and we will explore this later, because it's a kind of possibility to see the museum phenomenon through the light of geopolitics, because there is a game of influence. Because, of course, when you have so many trainings of museology in English, it means that it's the English way of the Anglo-Saxon way to conceive museums, which starts to be widespread and transferred to the rest of the world. So it's a game of influence. Bruno and Aladeshenko wrote a very interesting article concerning this game of influence by exploring the number of references that were, and the language that were associated to two, actually three major publications. The ISS, which proved to be really international, the Dictionnaire encyclopédique de museology, and the International Handbook of Museum Studies published by Sharon MacDonald. And it's the numbers, the figures explain it very interestingly. It means that actually, if you could see that, of course, the majority of authors that are referenced in the Dictionnaire encyclopédique is 500, when you have 300 reference to Anglo-Saxon, and mostly no from other regions, actually the majority is much more important. The reference to Anglo-Saxon authors is mostly actually the only one, and there are mostly no reference from Francophone or other European and especially also other regions in these. Which means that the ideas that are behind the way of conceiving museums, such as in Eastern countries or such as in Latin American countries, is underestimated in these books. So that's the reason why we tried to make a much more international Dictionnaire de Museology, Dictionary of Museology, with, of course, some insistence with Northern America, Europe, but also Latin America, insisting on having a much more important repartition of authors around the world. We also decided to explore much more concepts than the 21 concept of museology, and we decided to, together with the editing committee, the scientific editing committee, to choose about 100 major concepts, and from these 100 major concepts to make some detailed definition with explanations, etc. In the total, actually, there are more than 1,200 terms that are defined, but the majority of the major concepts explore much more than actually what was the centrum of the Dictionnaire encyclopédique. They explore actually all of the issues that influence the way museums are evolving. And these will be, of course, the topics that we will discuss during the next days. Of course, for instance, the relation between museums and economy, and neoliberalism and capitalism, which could be, of course, seen as a metaphor of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, or actually, it's very interesting to see it also, the inauguration of the Jewish Museum in Berlin that was inaugurated without any collection, and it was just explored and seen and visited during 3 years empty. So it means also that these ways of conceiving star architecture and museum buildings in a successful way in order to attract more visitors, etc., is also influencing the relation between the museums, its collection, etc. The relation, of course, within the collection and the museum is also involving with the digital world, and you could see some more and more exhibition, but also exhibition center linked with only actually digital collections that are seen as museums by the public and more actually by some professionals. Of course, the relation between the public and the social responsibility is also very much linked with some terms as participation, the social role of museum, the social work, etc. All of these terms were much more important in the new dictionary. Of course, also the link with restitution and the link with decolonizing museum, the issues such as gender, and more globally, museum activism started to be a very important topic to discuss now because, of course, they are in close contact with the way the museum see itself as an evolving process. And, of course, also, another topic which is very important in the dictionary is the rise of climate awareness among museums, such as in the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice. So these are all the different terms that are explored in the dictionary. And somehow you could see the dictionary as a kind of map in order to represent the museum world and all of the terms that are linked with these worlds. And these are some of the things that we will discuss, I hope, with you during the next days. Thank you for your attention.
So, thank you, François. It was perfect in time. Yeah. So learn other speakers how to be in time. Are there any questions from our online listeners? No. Great, they are sleeping still. But thank you for presenting such in elegant and light ways this very complex issue of museology. And probably I just would give you the possibility. Do you have a question now for François? No, nobody has a question, but probably you could say in one sentence why museum practitioners need this understanding of this very complex, and also there's some language complexity and substantial complexity. Why museum practitioners do need to understand this, or yeah.
Very briefly, because of course I could speak about this with you during some hours. Very briefly, because museum practitioners need to think. And actually thinking is the most important thing, of course, in your work. And to give you the time to think is, a challenge, because you have always all of these different tasks to do and to make, and the preparation of an exhibition, etc. But just think on the roots of your own profession, own work, and this so difficult question, what is a museum? After 30 years of museum research, actually, I still don't know exactly, because actually the museum phenomenon is evolving, and that's the reason why actually it's important. If you think about the evolution of the museum, if you think that, oh wow, there's a trend now that is starting to emerging, it means that then you can take it and you can go much faster and you can really be totally in this trend, and of course give so much power to your own museum. So this link with, to me, with theory was definitely, as a museum director, because I have been a museum director during 10 years, it has been the key to the success of the museum, and we won some awards, etc. Because actually, I was really thinking and thinking about this evolution of the museum phenomenon. At that moment, and I could speak much longer actually, but at that moment, in 2007, I saw sometimes the digital world and of course the Museum 2.0 emerging. But I realized it very quickly. So at that moment, we were the very first museum on the French-speaking part of Belgium to be on Europeana. We went very often, well, we were among the very first one to be on Facebook, etc. Why? Because actually, we were thinking about how the museum would evolve, etc. And just to have this link between how will it change is such a good opportunity for your museum to raise and to grow up. That's the point.